familiar faces. Good afternoon and welcome to the special event sponsored by the Idaho Museum of Mining and Geology. I'm Clint Kuzo, Operations Director of the museum. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to recognize some individuals who have been instrumental in bringing about this event. For the museum, I would like to show our appreciation to Shirley Ewing, who arranged for Shawn to be here. Next, please show some appreciation to the team at the Old Penitentiary who made this possible today. Thanks to all of you. Our speaker today is a distinguished professor of geology at the College of Southern Idaho, Shawn Willsey. Shawn received his bachelor's degree in geology from Weber State University and his master's in geology from Northern Arizona University. He's a good friend of the museum and has led numerous highly rated field trips for members and guests. Shawn's become a prolific presence on YouTube, bringing his outstanding educational skills to a wide audience. He's recently passed the coveted 100,000 subscriber level. He's the author of Geology Underfoot in Southern Idaho and contributing author of the revised and much improved Roadside Geology of Idaho. Both of these books are available for purchase here in the back of the room and in the museum. The museum is just steps away from the entrance to the Old Penitentiary. As you leave the Old Pen, make a right, and right there. Shawn has reported on important geologic events, including volcanism in Hawaii and in Iceland, which is the subject of today's presentation. Please give a warm welcome to Shawn.
Thanks, Clint. It's wonderful to have everyone here. Appreciate everyone braving the heat, coming out here. Somewhat fitting that we're going to talk about a very cold place in the North Atlantic on this hot day, and maybe that'll bring some balance to your internal temperature or something. This is wonderful. I've done some things with the museum over the past maybe like 8 or 10 years. This is our biggest event so far, and if you told me years ago that, you know, putting YouTube videos up would bring me to this kind of, you know, bring geology to this many people, I would never have guessed it. So it's just a real thrilling to me to have you all here, whether it's through the books I've written or the videos. It's a real pleasure to be involved in a community of people who are trying to learn. So today we're going to be talking about Iceland, a place that I love, a place I've been traveling to now for almost a decade, and talking a little bit about some of the things that have been happening there over the past few months. So we'll start from the beginning and kind of look at what's been happening. Some of you I know are like voracious, you know, learners of Iceland, and you're hinging on every little nuance and GPS measurement and such, and others might be a little less involved, but we'll get something for everyone here and kind of go from there. So the first thing I want to point out here is the way this whole scenario and sequence of events has played out over the past, I guess, 8 to 9 months now. It really reminds me of like some sort of Hollywood script or some sort of movie that is out there. And if you think of some of the twists and turns that have taken place, it's been absolutely remarkable. I don't know that someone could have scripted some of the things that have happened there. It's been tragic at times. There's been unknowns in terms of the twists and turns of the plot. And then probably the most exciting, but also, if you live in Iceland and you're connected to some of these communities, I guess sort of, I don't want to say depressing, but humbling parts of this is that there's no end in sight. Some of the things that we're going to talk about today that began in October, no one knows exactly where this is going to go or how this is going to end. I think that makes it interesting and exciting, but it also makes it difficult for the people in those communities. So some of the plot twists here, we have a threatened fishing town. We have the #1 tourist attraction in Iceland, the Blue Lagoon, and the nearby power plant. So in terms of, again, a Hollywood type of script, to have like a cute little fishing village, the biggest tourist attraction, and a critical piece of infrastructure threatened by a natural event is kind of, you know, that's kind of a harrowing scene. We have the damage that was produced in November by the earthquake in Grindavik. We had people evacuated in the middle of the night. The entire town of about 10,000 residents were evacuated more or less within 12 hours. That would be kind of a, if you think about, again, the movie script and like these are scenes in the movie, these would be kind of big parts of the plot. What I'm always interested in with any sort of natural event is the interplay between the information that's acquired by scientists, how that's conveyed to the public officials, those that are actually making the decisions on behalf of the public, and then that's how that's conveyed and received by the public. And I'd say by and large, the way things have played out in Iceland, I don't know if you could have had it run any smoother than it has there. Sure, there's people that can second guess decisions. Sure, there's, everything hasn't been perfect. There's been little mistakes made along the way. But I think if you threw this same event into other countries or other communities, it is a big mess and a huge just junk show. And I think they've handled it really well. And that, again, that's maybe some of the respect I've gained for that community and that country. They fought back. They actually did some things proactively rather than just saying, well, if the volcano gets us, it gets us. They did things to protect those critical pieces of infrastructure as best they could and built up these big defensive walls and berms around those three pieces of infrastructure we talked about, the town, the power plant, and the Blue Lagoon. So again, back to the Hollywood movie, like, okay, the town's kind of fighting back and doing something. And then another piece of, and these are all things that have happened. What's going to happen, how does this rest of this movie or this story go? No one knows. But they did have their pipeline, their hot water pipeline was cut off in February. And so they had a couple days in this very cold climate in February dealing with lack of hot water and heat in parts of the Reykjanes Peninsula. And there were a few homes destroyed, so not as many as could have been. So I think they've done really well, but again, the future is unknown. So what I'm going to do here today is walk you through what's transpired. We'll first start with a big look of Iceland and why this area is volcanically active, kind of set the geologic setting for those that might not be as aware. Then work our way through some of the things that have happened there over the past few months. If you've been watching this thing religiously and following all the different updates, then you're going to know a lot of this stuff, but hopefully there's some new little nuggets of information that will be thrown in there as well. And then I guess the last big thing there is there's been a significant impact on their economy and their tourism. And so I'm going to say to all of you as my friends here, and you can help spread the word for me, Iceland is open. Iceland is fully prepared to accommodate tourists. There is no reason to change your or anyone else's travel plans to Iceland because of the things that have been transpiring there. I think a lot of the headlines that came across in the news, people took those differently, and a lot of people thought, well, we can't go there because it's near the airport and it's a volcano, and I saw a movie once on the HBO about a volcano, and people thinking sort of alarmism things. This is impacting a very small percentage and part of a very large country, and you can't go into the town right now, and there's a couple roads, secondary roads that are impacted, but that's kind of it. So it's interesting to me, again, just kind of the way this kind of has played out. Some of the narratives look a lot like some sort of Hollywood script. So my connection to Iceland began in 2015. My wife and I went there on just a trip. She found like a good little deal, like a 4-day trip, just kind of a quick little recon trip. And then I started taking classes there. So the bottom left corner is the first class I took in 2018. Then in August of 2022, it erupted, and I'd kind of been watching it. It erupted in 2021 for 6 months. It was like, and these eruptions were the most tourist-friendly eruptions I've ever seen. Like, imagine flying into an international airport, getting in your rental car, driving a half an hour, parking, and then hiking on a trail a couple miles, and there it is in front of you. Lava, an active vent. It was just spectacular. So I kicked myself for not going in 2021. So in 2022, when this happened, I called my wife excitedly and said, it just started erupting, and she said, go. Just get a ticket and go. And so I did, because you never know how long it's going to last. If you're like, well, I'll go next month, well, it could be over by then. And this specific eruption in 2022 only lasted about a month. It was like 3 to 4 weeks or something like that. But I was able to go. I've been to active eruptions or I guess lava flows in the past in Hawaii, but this was my first Iceland eruption experience, and it was spectacular. And I hiked in along with, again, a couple hundred people there. It was a great experience. Then more recently I've taken groups, another college group and then a group of YouTube viewers went with me this last May to Iceland and took them all around. I'll kind of tie back into that story here in a little bit when we get to some of the things that have been going on. But this is a country and an area and a geologic landscape that's been near and dear to my heart for quite some time. So for now and for the foreseeable future, I'll be in Iceland at least once a year because there's so much to see, so much still I want to do there. So all this began for me, at least I think the connection with a lot of you folks too might have began about this time. I was watching the scientific data in Iceland in late October, and saw the earthquakes that were happening, and sitting there at my computer looking at geeky graphs and scientific data. And on a total whim on November 3rd, I thought, what if I turned on my webcam, recorded me talking and looking at graphs, and put that on YouTube? I'm like, no one's going to watch this. This is going to be just a total train wreck. But I did it anyway. But the response was incredible. It brought people to me and brought me to people from all over Europe. I had no idea that people were going to watch and be entertained and educated by watching me at my computer, just looking at stuff. I never would have guessed that, but it became a big thing. And so as the geologic events ramped up through early November, I was there diligently providing updates as quickly as I could, learning with my viewers about what was going on. I didn't proclaim to be the expert. I'm just saying, hey, here's the data, and here's what I'm seeing as a geologist, and here's my interpretation of this. And that was kind of where that went. But it was pretty interesting. And so let's start a little bit with Iceland. It's about half the size of Idaho. So if you cut Idaho in half, that's pretty much the size of Iceland to give you a sense for scale. It's a big place. It takes a long time to drive all the way around Iceland. It's a very big country, no freeways. The interior is all really remote gravel roads where you have to cross a lot of rivers. You need four-wheel drives and snorkels, and there's snow in the interior well into June in a lot of years. But it's a fascinating landscape. If you like going to countries and going to museums and seeing old buildings and architecture and human culture, don't go to Iceland. That should not be on your travel list. But if you like going to places where there's landscapes and waterfalls and volcanoes and just huge mountains and kind of a Lord of the Rings looking landscape, then this would be a good place to add to your list if you haven't been already. So this is Iceland in the North Atlantic. Most of you know where it sits. It was only 15, 20,000 years ago, it was completely covered in ice. The whole thing was a large ice cap. Since then, the ice has retreated, and there's just a few of these glaciers that are left behind. But this one here, Vatnajökull, is the largest glacier in Europe. So this is still a very large ice cap, bigger than a single glacier that sits over Iceland. So the name still, Iceland was supposed to be Greenland, Greenland was supposed to be Iceland. Everyone knows that story. But there's still quite a lot of ice still in Iceland even today. Geologically, it's an interesting location, and I think every student, whether formally or informally, of geology knows a little bit about Iceland in terms of its setting. It sits along the mid-Atlantic ridge. It's the only part, essentially, of the mid-Atlantic ridge in the Atlantic Ocean where the boundary between those two plates, that spreading zone where the two plates are spreading apart, what we call a divergent plate boundary, where it actually comes up above sea level. Most of this boundary is thousands of feet below the ocean level. You can't see it. It's hard to access it. It's hard to make observations. But here's a section of it that actually comes up above sea level, and we can explore it and observe it and look at its geology. So the whole country and island is more or less divided into two halves. One sits over the Eurasian tectonic plate, and the other part sits over the North American tectonic plate. It gets a little messy in here, and I could spend another 10 minutes deep diving this, but I won't. But suffice it to say that the plate boundary is in the process right now, at least we think, of transferring and moving. It's what we call a plate boundary jump, although jump's probably the wrong verb to use because nothing in geology often happens as, like a jump, like quickly. But the plate boundary is slowly moving from this active zone here over to this one. And right now they're both active volcanically, so they're both producing eruptions on occasion. It's a young island. It's only about 25 million years old. So Iceland as an entity and as land has only been above sea level and existed for about 25 million years, as opposed to Idaho, where we have rocks that are over 2.5 billion years. So the rocks in Iceland are quite young geologically. And those two plates are only moving apart about 1 centimeter per year, pretty slowly. But again, given enough years, it produces big significant features. And then the interesting thing about Iceland, if that was the end of it, it'd be like, okay, we've got plenty of those types of places worldwide. But Iceland is also what we call a hotspot. It's also a place where there's an anomalously high amount of magma rising from deep within the earth, producing a lot of the volcanic activity. So that's why it sits above sea level, is so much magma is coming out of this one section of the mid-Atlantic ridge that it's just piling up, and building up above sea level, much like Hawaii, but Hawaii is just a hot spot, not also a divergent plate boundary. So that's sort of the overview of the tectonic setting in Iceland, which makes it interesting, of course, to geologists, but also gives it this very dynamic and interesting landscape. This kind of is a little bit more detailed, but this shows you the volcanic zone. So here's one part of the plate boundary coming up from the Atlantic onto the Reykjanes Peninsula here. This is the area we're going to spend most of our time focusing on. All these kind of red blobs you see here are different volcanoes. So Iceland has, oh shoot, I didn't count, but maybe like 20 to 30 considered active volcanic regions. Some produce fairly innocuous lava flows like what we're seeing over the last few months on the Reykjanes Peninsula. Other volcanoes sit underneath the glacier, and in 2010, some of you might remember the big eruption that took place in Iceland that was very explosive, put a bunch of ash into the atmosphere, shut down traffic, air traffic in Europe for the better part of 2 weeks. So we have both effusive, or what I'd call a nice volcano, and then we have more explosive, or what I'd call a naughty volcano in Iceland. So we have two different types of volcanic systems that are present there. And they transect the entire country right through the highlands and then up to the north coast here. This is just another map sort of showing where these volcanic systems are. Interesting because we define the volcanic system geographically. If we say, oh, there's a volcano over there and there's one over there, then we label them differently. But now we're starting to come around to the idea that at least on the Reykjanes Peninsula, they're actually tied together. The chemistry of the magmas and some other data suggests that they're actually tied together, still erupting in two different locations spatially, but it's a common source that drives those. So there's a lot of research going on in Iceland. I can't keep up with all the papers that keep coming out and the journal articles about Iceland. I'm a little backlogged. So again, if we focus on this part of Iceland for the rest of our time here together, and look at this little Google Earth image I put together. Here's the town of Grindavik on the south coast of the Reykjanes Peninsula. It's an important place because the geology has transpired there such that it has a naturally protected harbor. So this is one of the only places on this part of the south coast of Iceland where they can go out and fish and then bring their ships in and leave them someplace that's protected. The swells and the ocean waves coming into the south coast of Iceland are very energetic, and if you tried to park your boat anywhere else along that coastline, it would just get smashed to bits. So this community has existed for hundreds of years, maybe as much as 1,000 years. People have been like sort of in this area. But this is the town of interest that we'll kind of look at. And then just a few miles up the road, there is a power plant, the Svartsengi power plant, which provides hot water, electricity, heat to 30,000 or so people in the region. They take as they pump out that geothermal water, that water ponds into sort of some lava fields nearby. And in the 80s, someone thought like, wow, this is kind of good looking water, and maybe people would want to like sit and soak in this hot water. So someone developed it into an attraction that's now called the Blue Lagoon. And now it's the #1 tourist attraction in Iceland with, I can't remember how many visitors come there every year, but it is a big operation. It employs a lot of people. So a lot of people go and soak in this pretty blue water in these lava fields, but all it is the effluent or the discharge, if you will, coming out of the power plant. But people don't seem to mind. They still soak in it. So everyone seems happy. And then the international airport is right up here. And then Reykjavik would be kind of off the map over here. So if you flew into Iceland, you'd fly in here, and a short drive would get you down into this region. But this is the area we're going to look at, and hopefully some of you probably can't see all of this, but if you look at just the landscape in Iceland, you'll see a lot of linear features running across the landscape more or less in a southwest-northeast direction. That's because they're controlled by the faults and the volcanic vents that have formed in response to these plate boundaries that have occurred here. So every bit of the landscape is tied to what's going on with the plate boundaries and the way the volcanoes are erupting there. So you see that fabric, that sort of southwest-northeast trend pretty much everywhere in this part of Iceland. One last little look at the whole kind of overview. So Grindavik down here, North American plate, Eurasian plate. There's places that'll just draw a straight line through there, but it's more complicated than that. Very rarely do we have a place where you can stand and touch two plates. I know when you go to Iceland, your Instagram feeds and your tourist brochures are going to tell you that you can scuba dive between two plates, or you can stand on either side of this bridge. That's a little bit of a lie, I suppose, just kind of stretching the truth a little bit. They're actually zones. They're actually regions where the plates are pulling apart, and it's a set of structures, a set of features that defines that plate boundary. It's not often one fault or one crack or one feature that defines that. And you can kind of see here, hopefully the lighting's not awesome, but I've drawn some red lines on here. These are some of the volcanic systems and the fault systems that run across the Reykjanes Peninsula. So the plate boundary comes up here, and if you just kind of link these all together, the plate boundary runs across this way. But again, it's more complicated than that. It's a set of systems and a set of features. Here's another map that kind of defines these. So again, we've given these all names. Some of the geologists there have named each one of these volcanic systems, but we're starting to see now that they're probably a little bit more tied together than we thought previously. So the first one here is the Reykjanes volcanic system. The one that's erupting now is the Svartsengi system. The one that erupted 2021, 22, 23, 3 years prior, is the Fagradalsfjall system. Does anyone speak fluent Icelandic? Okay, so I'm in good shape then. So as I pronounce these words, I'm going to feel okay that no one's over there like just, okay. And then you can see, a couple other of these systems as well. Most of these, have geothermal systems tied to them. So if you go to Iceland, there's a power plant down here at the tip. There's the Svartsengi system. There's not a power plant here, but there's a geothermal area with hot springs and mud pots. It looks a lot like Yellowstone. And then the big power plant is over here near Hengil, and this supplies a lot of Reykjavik with its power and hot water as well. So each one of these volcanic systems has a shallow geothermal resource, kind of like Boise, right, where you guys have hot water in the ground that heats downtown and is used locally. So very similar to that. This silly little graph here, well, I guess it's not so silly, shows each one of those systems across the top. And then here's a timeline going back to 4,000 years ago. And each little yellow or red bar in there is when that system was volcanically active. And this is one of the more interesting things I've found in looking at the data, is you can see it is episodic. Usually a lot of volcanoes don't behave this way. They are more erratic, and we can sometimes put together a timeline, but nature doesn't work on like an alarm clock, right? Nature's not like, oh, Yellowstone had an eruption 700,000 years ago, time for another one. And usually when we take events and put together what we call a recurrence interval, how often something happens based on just a few data points, that's not good science. That's not good mathematics either. And so looking at these, we only have 3 data points. So each one of these systems appears to have been volcanically active. Doesn't mean it was erupting every single day, but it was on and off erupting for, in some cases, up to 500 years over these time intervals. So you can see from about 3,500 years to 3,000 years, looks like 5 of the 7 or so volcanic systems were very active. And then there was a period of quiescence where nothing erupted. There was no volcanic activity for hundreds of years, maybe up to 800 to 900 years. And then there was another period where it looks like 6 of those 7 systems were active for some period of time. And then another quiet period. And then the most recent one, which was from about 750 to 1,200 or so years ago, it looks like 5 or so of them were erupting again. And then we get to more modern times. This area hasn't seen anything till 2021. So until 2021, the Reykjanes Peninsula hadn't seen an eruption for 800 years. That was the most recent eruption in this region. And now, during our lifetimes, we're seeing an uptick. And they use this phrase, I don't like the phrase, but you hear it a lot in in Iceland and other places, the volcanic system is waking up. I don't know why I don't like that, but I don't know, I think there's probably a better term that could be used there. But it does seem to be true that we have 3 eruptions, 2021, 22, 23, and then just since December of this year, we've had 5, and we're about ready to have maybe the 6th one. We had December, January, February, there was one in March, then there was one in May. So that's 5 eruptions in that area. So looking at what this system has done in the past, and we wish we had more data than just these 3 intervals, but that's all we have. It does seem very much like this area, this region of Iceland, will be volcanically active for the foreseeable future. How many years will that be? Don't know. Could it be hundreds of years? Possibly. And so Iceland is preparing with that mindset in place that, wow, we're going to have to deal with outpourings of lava, eruptions, earthquake activity over the next, not just decades, but maybe even centuries in this region. So kind of a sobering reality to face, and one in which I don't know a lot of other places have really dealt with that. So pretty interesting. Okay, so what happens when we get eruptions in Iceland? What do these look like? I think most of you know most Icelandic eruptions are quite passive. They erupt this very fluid type of rock called basalt. As Southern Idaho residents, if you're from here, you should know this rock because this is the rock that makes up most of the Snake River Plain. It's what you see at Craters of the Moon. It's what you see locally here in Boise. If you drive, just along the river towards Lucky Peak, that's what's lining both sides of the Boise River in those places. And these types of eruptions are quite passive. They're not explosive. That's why they're, in some instances, they can be quite tourist friendly. So we often sometimes get these fissure eruptions where the eruptions are coming out of these linear cracks or fractures. The lava is pouring out across the landscape. It's not explosive. It's not producing a lot of ash. As long as you use common sense and, and that sort of thing, usually you can watch these things from a pretty safe distance. And a lot of these eruptions on the Reykjanes Peninsula start out this way, as these big linear fractures that the vent occupies because they're following the tectonic faults that are in place there. The magma is just looking for the easiest path to the surface, and it's finding these already existing fractures and cracks in the rock, and then it's filling those in and exploiting those. So fissure eruptions, you can see as you work your way around Iceland, you can actually see what these look like in the past, or how these are actually, fed towards the surface by looking in places. You'll see these lines that cut through the rocks. These are called dikes. So this is actually an older feeder system. So this was actually the conduit that the magma worked its way through before it fed a lava flow at the surface. So it's kind of cool to actually see these sort of in the ancient record and then envision what these look like today. So these are called feeder dikes. A lot of times these fissure eruptions start out spectacular. It might be 2-mile long fissure, just all fountaining lava. But as the eruption progresses and starts to wane a little bit, it tends to consolidate the output of lava in just a few locations. And these tend to become what we call spatter cones. Again, you can see these out at Craters of the Moon. We're lucky to live in Idaho so if you don't make it to Iceland, go out to Craters of the Moon. It's the next best thing, right? But these spatter cones are just spitting out clots of lava around the vent. Those clots fall down around the vent and build up and make the cone that exists adjacent to that vent. So you can see here, this is a little spatter cone from, I think this was with the March eruption, just spitting out lava. It accumulates around the margin. So these are fairly small though, right? When people think of volcanoes, they think of like Mount St. Helens, something much larger. These tend to not be much bigger than this size. Maybe 100 feet would be kind of pushing it. They tend to be destructive in some ways. So while they're spitting out lava and it's building up, there's also in the pit a big crater, like a lava lake, and the activity there has very steep sides to it, and it can undermine the walls of the spatter cone, and it can collapse a little bit. So watch this one here. Watch the top rim, the skyline of this spatter cone while I run you through a couple of just images here. These are all on the same day. So this is all from June 6th of this year. So there's this lovely little spatter cone's profile at one point in time. A few minutes or hours later, you can see it kind of collapses a little bit, a little more jagged here. Then it builds back up sometime later. Then you can see it erupting here. Then you can see it drop back down, so it's collapsing. So it's constantly playing this constructive, destructive back and forth game. And that's why they're kind of limited to height. You have to be able to throw the lava up to the rim to build it up, and you typically only have so much explosive energy to eject that lava. So they can't be thousands of feet high. They can't be 300 or 400 feet high. They're limited by the eruption dynamics a little bit. Let's see what happened here. Oh, watch this chunk right here in the next shot. You can see it kind of just gone away right there. And then it's spitting out some more. Yeah, so anyway, you can kind of get the idea there. These kind of rise and fall a little bit over time. We don't see any of these happening so far, but possibly, and you do get these in some places in Iceland, if we have a more sustained eruption that lasts longer, it's possible to build a bigger, broader volcano called a shield volcano. Again, as residents of Idaho, we should know these because as you drive east through the Snake River Plain towards where I live, Twin Falls, every little low kind of profile hill in the surrounding landscape is one of these shield volcanoes for the most part. There's some great ones out by Mountain Home. These are volcanoes where the lava has just poured out like pancake batter and built up kind of a low profile dome around the vent there. So we do have these in Iceland. This is one of the biggest ones there. This is an exceptionally large one there. Skjaldbreithur. No, probably butchered that, but that was close. So there's a shield volcano. So let's turn now to exactly what's taken place in Iceland since 2021, and then more specifically these last 8 or so months. So here's our map of Grindavik, power plant, Blue Lagoon, airport. And here's the location of those 3 eruptions that were the tourist-friendly ones. So if you wanted to see Iceland in lava, I hope you'll still be able to do that. But really, you kind of missed it because that was a really good opportunity. We might get that back again. These eruptions here, and you might ask yourself, well, what's so different about eruptions here versus eruptions here? Well, these eruptions are up in these hills, confined valleys, no town nearby, no roadways. Most of the time you're hiking in from the top and looking down on these vents and lava fields. As long as the wind was favorable that day and not blowing those gases towards you, it was just the most, again, public-friendly type of eruption you can envision. The lava wasn't pouring downhill towards some sort of infrastructure. So there were several reasons why these eruptions became just such tourist magnets. And Iceland recognized that. I think it's part of their culture that they recognize that here's something incredible happening. We want people to enjoy it. So just, when you park your car, there's sometimes some search and rescue people milling around, but they have very much the attitude of like, be smart, don't be dumb, good luck. It's not over-regulated like it is here in the States where you'd have walkways and boardwalks and just everything would be super confined. And they don't have the manpower for that either, quite frankly. They don't have the people to monitor the thousands of tourists that were up there during that period. But notice this is where those 3 eruptions were. And just to kind of give you a view of what these look like. So here's, a couple hundred people along with some search and rescue people just hanging out by a volcano, eating a sandwich, no big deal. This is exactly what it was like in 2021. 2022, so this was pretty fun for me. There's me collecting a sample of the lava. That was pretty awesome. And then in 2023, again, people just, going out, taking selfies, pretty chill. But then things changed substantially. So 2023, in July of last year, so about a year ago, really, that eruption was taking place. It only lasted maybe 4 to 6 weeks, and then things went quiet on the peninsula. If you'd asked any geologist at that point, where are we going to see another eruption? I would have just said, probably same area, same area we've been seeing the last 3, makes sense, right? But things changed. We started seeing a lot of earthquakes. Here's the coastline. Grindavik is right here. The eruptions I just talked about are over here. And you can see a lot of earthquake activity over this 2-week or so period, 10-day period occurring in this region. These are all earthquakes. The bigger the circle, the bigger the magnitude. And so these are forming in a region. Now, earthquakes in and of themselves don't necessarily mean magma and volcanoes. Earthquakes just mean rocks are breaking. Rocks are under stress, either from tectonics, magma, something else is causing the rocks to be under stress and then shift, break, and rupture, and that's what's generating the earthquake. But the earthquakes, when you combine with some of the other data, like this, tells us it was magma. So the land literally was starting to rise near the power plant. So there's the Blue Lagoon, all the tourists there. There's the power plant. Grindavik sits over this hill in this view here. This is the big hotel at the Blue Lagoon and the spa resort. And literally, this is the area where the ground was rising. So again, you couldn't have scripted this any crazier, right? Like, oh, where will we see the uplift occurring in Iceland? It's a big country. How about underneath your number one tourist attraction? Like literally right underneath it. Unprecedented. And this is the kind of data that we were looking at. It's a little bit cut off there at the bottom, but the GPS data was really helpful. So the GPS data just tells us, as many of you know, it gives us three-dimensional information, where that location is over time with respect to north and south, where it is east to west, and where it is up and down. And if you just took the GPS measurement of my house every day for the next year, I would assume it's all the same, because I don't think my house is really moving appreciably, right? But in Iceland, things are moving because we have these other forces at play beneath them. So you can see here, things not really doing much. This is a north-south plot, so if the dots go up, then this specific station is moving to the north. If it moves down on the plot, it's moving to the south. You can see here, as we get into, this would be October. So as the end of October comes, things start moving substantially to the south. This is an east-west plot. So if it goes up, it's to the east. You can see things are moving to the south, to the east. And then this one's the one that makes probably the most sense to most folks. You can see things moving up. So this is where we started seeing uplift, right? The ground is literally rising and swelling, and there's earthquakes happening in the subsurface in response to this magma that's pooling into the crust and pushing on the rocks and breaking the rocks and causing the ground to rise. Now, was the ground rising feet? No, it was rising like inches, right? But still, it was measurable, and it was continuous, and it was cause for some concern moving forward. There's other ways we can measure ground movement using satellites. So this is INSAR data passing over an area, and sort of like radar, we bounce it off the ground and have that bit of data. Then you fly over it another time, and it bounces off of it again. And because there's been a change since the first time you flew over it, it measures that change. So over here, where it's purple and blue, no change. The ground was the same from October 28th to November 6th. But in this area, just north of Grindavik and near the power plant, you can see sort of the bullseye pattern here. So substantial change in the ground as the magma was welling up. So remember, the magma accumulation, that's our interpretation. First, we start with the data, earthquakes, ground deformation, right? And then the magma is the interpretation of what's causing that. So those are two different sorts of things. This all reached a big crescendo. If there was a climax to this event so far, you could argue the volcanic eruptions were a climax, but for many of the residents of Grindavik, the day that they will remember forever was November 10th. And leading up to November 10th, there was a lot of earthquake activity, earthquakes up to magnitude 5 or so, or a magnitude 5 earthquake underneath your community will get your attention. It will shake somewhat violently. It won't collapse the house. No one's going to die. Things might fall off the shelves, but it is a substantial earthquake to have a shallow magnitude 5 earthquake in your immediate vicinity. And you can see where all these earthquakes plot up here on that southwest-northeast trend we talked about. And so this was the data coming in over just a 3-day period. And so some of the sizes of these circles, these are magnitude 4 and 5 earthquakes. So these are some very large earthquakes. And all these people in Grindavik remember these days leading up to it. And what we interpreted that as scientists, what we ended up making the decision of what was causing those earthquakes was the injection of magma into the subsurface, moving away from the power plant laterally to the east and forming a dike. So just like those dikes I showed you in the outcrops, this would be a dike in the subsurface, probably not very wide, maybe only a meter or less in terms of its width. But as that magma pushes its way through those fractures and forces them apart, that's what's generating the earthquakes. And this is all in Icelandic, but we can still see here, there's Grindavik here, and you can see the intrusion of this dike beneath not just the town, but areas as well. I mean, that was the other crazy thing too, is the uplift was here. So if you'd asked anyone where was the volcano going to erupt, where the uplift is. But that's not what happened. The uplift was where the magma was pooling, but it found an easier pathway towards the surface along these old fractures and fault systems that existed. And unfortunately, that went right underneath the town, literally. And so this is what ended up happening is those earthquakes produced what we call a graben, so a downdropped block of the crust bounded by faults on either side. So the faults are shown on the map here in pink with the little teeth, and you can see this fault here goes right through the town. There's Grindavik, there's the power plant, and the Blue Lagoon right up here. And so what was happening is the dike was coming up, but it didn't quite get to the surface. On November 10th, if you'd asked me what was going to happen in the next 12 hours, I even had one of my videos that said eruption imminent, because I thought for sure it's happening. And it wasn't just me out on a ledge somewhere. Like the scientific community, everyone looking at the data saw the same thing. Intense earthquake activity, the magma intrusion, the earthquakes getting shallower towards the surface. This only ends one way, or so we thought, that it was going to end with an eruption on November 10th or possibly the next day. Turns out it didn't happen that way, though. It turns out that magma came within maybe a half a kilometer of the surface, but didn't quite have either the pressure or the energy, or maybe the rocks above were a little bit more resistant, and it didn't propagate up to the surface and feed an eruption. And so it stopped. And then people took a deep breath. November 10th and 11th was over, but the magma was still down there, and it was still accumulating, even though it had moved into this other area. Of course, during November 10th, with all the earthquake activity happening and an eruption appearing likely and possible under the town was evacuated in basically a single night. They, in a very calm, orderly manner, got people and their pets and their kids and their loved ones out of the area. 8,000 to 9,000 residents or so were evacuated in a single night. And I don't know if that happens as smoothly when we have hurricane evacuations in the US or in other places, but they did it really well there. They got everyone out. And then it was kind of a waiting game, because we're evacuated, now what? Because now either the eruption takes place or something happens. And here's some of the damage that took place in the area. So you can see some of the big cracks here. This is the sports complex right near the central part of the town. This is that same sports complex from a different viewpoint. So again, this is all from the earthquakes and the faulting that took place, all this deformation to the infrastructure. This is the number one reason why you can't go back into Grindavik right now. It's not so much that you're going to get killed by lava or anything like that. It's that there's these big cracks in the ground. It's just not safe. The infrastructure has been damaged. And that's likely to continue for some time. This is just a map showing what they started to do, recognizing that lava was likely to be on the surface at some point. They started building these defensive berms around the infrastructure. So they started with the power plant, because that, even though the town was there, the town was not happy about this decision to build the berms around the power plant first. But stepping back and looking at it logically, it kind of makes sense that this power plant's more critical to more people than the town and the homes themselves. And so the decision was made to build these berms around the power plant and the Blue Lagoon here. And this is what they look like. They're big. There's a normal-sized person for scale. These are about 30 feet tall. And the idea here is you're not trying to stop the lava, you're just trying to divert the lava around whatever it is you're trying to protect. Again, a kind of a novel concept. We haven't really seen this deployed on this scale, at least that I'm aware of. There's been a few things in Italy they've done. There's been other attempts in other locations to reroute lava and do some things, but this is probably one of the bigger instances of this happening, at least in modern times. So these big berms here that are built around. Well, eventually what happened was we did get an eruption. So that magma that was accumulating, the pressure kept building, and we finally did get an eruption on December 18th of this past year. It was huge, it was spectacular. December 18th, right near the winter solstice, so it's dark for 20 hours of the day, something like that. And you can see the big fissures that erupted here during that time. Here's the location of the fissure, so Grindavik down here, Blue Lagoon power plant, and December eruption was in a good place. People were like, okay, if this is where the volcano is going to erupt, maybe we can get through this thing, because it was further to the north on the system. So it wasn't down towards the town, it was much further north. And so there was some optimism even among Grindavik residents who obviously had been evacuated and were not able to be at their homes for Christmas. At least during this eruption, they thought, okay, if this is where this thing's going to erupt, we can deal with that because it's far enough away from town that I think there's some wiggle room here. But it turns out during the next eruption on January 14th, instead of being up here where it was in December, it was further down here. And you can see the primary fissure here in January was across one of the defensive berms. So this is the earthen berms they built up around Grindavik. It actually erupted partly through that. And then another alarming thing was a small fissure opened up right here, just north of town, and this ended up taking out 3 homes. So January 14th, when I've talked to some people from Grindavik, they're like, hey, we were pretty optimistic in December. Once January 14th happened, it was kind of like, this is a lost cause. Like they didn't have as much optimism that they could live in the town. At least that's the consensus view. I'm sure it's different person to person. So you can see here during the eruption, there's the fissure back here. Here's the earthen berm, and they are working. There's the lava flow. Literally, the lava flow is moving down towards your view there, and there's these brave heavy equipment operators moving the earth material around as quickly as they can ahead of the lava flow. I mean, again, like if we go back to the Hollywood movie script thing, right? Wouldn't that you could jazz this up with some Hollywood effects and make this look pretty intense. There was a cool highlight here for me personally. This actually was our anniversary. I got up at 3:30 in the morning because my phone was literally blowing up, I guess is the phrase. People were like, the eruption started. And so I'm like, okay. So I dragged myself into school. It was a snowy morning. And I was working with a drone company called Nature Eye. And they have a drone on the ground there, but I can pilot it from my office in Twin Falls, which is pretty cool. And so we get the drone up, we're flying around, it's pretty cool, it's awesome, we're looking at all this lava and the fissure, and then we noticed in the distance, close to town, there was this plume of steam or gas coming out of the ground. So I said, hey, we need to go fly down there. So we flew down there, and literally we got to watch in real time, right before our eyes, this vent open up. Basically, we got to see volcanic gases coming out of the ground, and then lava starts spitting out of the ground and then forming these lava flows that are literally a football field away from the north edge of town and the houses. And so it was exciting, it was really cool, but also there was this kind of depression and heartbreak knowing that, okay, like those are people's houses right there. And also because this had opened up so close to town, I kept looking further south thinking like, is there going to be another fissure that opens up and another vent that opens up right in the middle of town? And luckily that didn't happen. Luckily this fissure was pretty short-lived. It only lasted maybe an hour or so. It did take out 3 of the homes here, but it didn't last as long as it might have otherwise. And so here you can see this small fissure. There's the main lava flow back here, power plant, Blue Lagoon. This is the north edge of town, and this thing just rolled down this little valley and ended up destroying 3 homes here before it stopped. It pretty much stopped, I mean, not much further after this photo was taken. That's about the extent of that lava flow. We were able to go back in there in May. Just this past May, I was able to go into Grindavik with a police escort, and this is that same lava flow. And the craziest thing happened. The lava is up against this wood fence, but somehow it didn't incinerate it, catch it on fire, and it just stopped. I mean, it was like if there's a symbol for Icelandic fortitude, it's this fence, I guess, because the fence, I don't know, but there were some homes in the area that were burned down and stuff. But it was pretty neat to see. It was kind of sad. It looked like a lot like a ghost town. There weren't a lot of people in town. You could see all the damage there. It was mostly kind of depressing. So moving ahead. That eruption ends, the magma's still inflating. We go through this cycle of the GPS measurements show the uplift going on. As we get closer to the eruption date, the earthquakes pick up, and then we see another eruption here in February. Luckily, the next eruption after the January one wasn't closer to town, but it moved back up here to where it was back in December. So it was further away from the town. This one, though, did wreak some havoc because it sent flows down here to the west, and this flow here took out the road. That was bad but not awful. But more importantly, coming out of the power plant right here is a pipeline, and this pipeline is what takes the hot water and the heat to tens of thousands of people on the peninsula. So this pipeline, which was sitting on the ground, was completely destroyed by the lava flow. Since then, they've actually re-engineered it, and they've got it buried, and they've got it set up so that if there's another lava flow in that area, it won't be as impactful. But this was the February eruption, and the February eruption occurred during a period of time where it was kind of windy. We had winds out of the north. So even though these eruptions aren't explosive, like I said, as it's throwing out these little clots of lava, it is throwing stuff into the air, and the wind can catch the smallest pieces of that material and blow it downwind. And so, well, first here's a good photo of the whole thing in February. But if you walk around Grindavik, as I walked around in May of this past year, in the grass, there were little chunks of what we call tephra, basically pieces of lava that were carried and blown by the wind. They were just sitting in the grass everywhere. So these were basically February 8th rocks of this year, 2024, just sitting in the grass all over the town there. Here's the flow that came across the road there, just north of the power plant in February. And then again, what happened after this eruption? This eruption only lasted a few days. At this point, we were kind of into a pattern. Like we were starting to be like, okay, we get an eruption, we deal with what happens, and then we go into a phase of magma still coming up from deep. There's more inflation, and then we're going to have another eruption. And it's all about knowing when that next eruption is going to take place and the exact location of where. But at this point, we felt pretty good about the fact that there was a plumbing system that had been established by the magma. The magma had a pathway where it was taking the magma from underneath the power plant area over to the east, and then it was erupting through these vents here. So we felt pretty good that it was going to stay in that area. And so the next eruption was in March. So you can see December there, February, and then March is kind of shown here with this blue outline, which is probably a little hard to see. Of course, the January one was kind of the crazy one that was further to the south. Luckily, the March one was largely in the same location. This one was a little bit bigger in terms of volume. It did send a lava flow down to the berms. The berms did a great job of deflecting this flow about to here. There was some concern for a while that lava was actually going to make its way to the ocean, which would have presented another set of hazards. When you have lava going into water, you're going to generate more acidic aerosols. You're going to flash that water to steam, so it can be locally explosive. So there were some other factors, and it was also going to maybe take out, the roadway here on the south margin, which didn't happen. So the March 16th eruption looked like this. Again, another spectacular fissure during the night. A lot of these were just great because it was the time of year where it was nighttime a lot. And then this eruption lasted a little longer than the rest. This one lasted it went into the end of April, if I remember right. So this one was about a 6-week-long eruption. It did, like a lot of the other eruptions, end up concentrating most of its effect or efforts later on as just a single spatter cone. So most of this time period was just this one spatter cone. There was an exciting day in April where this spatter cone had an outlet along the bottom, but it became plugged. And so the lava lake in the spatter cone started to fill and rise like a bathtub, and it started flowing over the top of the rim here. And that's what you can see here is this outlet channel. So that was kind of an exciting day in April. And if you were following this stuff day to day, there was always something new. It wasn't like, well, it's just doing the same thing. There's some of you might be in this room right now. There's people that are watching the webcams like for large chunks of their day. It's what's going on in the background while they're folding laundry, and they're like glued to seeing like exactly these little changes. I mean, I'll admit I'm not that tied to it. I kind of pop in and pop out a little bit, but it is kind of addicting to kind of watch what's going on over time there. This kind of shows the accumulation of what took place. The bottom scale's cut off here, but this is back in the fall of 2023. Here's the inflation that resulted in the November 10th intrusion and all the earthquakes. So when you see this rise and then drop, that's because the magma has left that area and moved somewhere else. Okay, so that could either be an eruption or it would be an intrusion, magma moving to some other location. So you can see that's November 10th, and the magma started inflating again. December 18th, we had an eruption, magma inflating. February 8th, March 16th. There's a little hiccup here, but then the next one here would be, I think this was the May the May eruption here, which we haven't quite got to. But you can see that kind of going over time. So the most recent eruption, kind of winding down here, we're almost done with the presentation here, team, is this fissure eruption here in late May, on May 29th. Pretty much the same location as the others, equally spectacular. This one, of course, in the day, because now we're at a time of year when they have a lot of daylight hours, not as much darkness. So this was May 29th. Where was I May 29th, you might ask? I was in Iceland. How fortuitous, right? What perfect timing. There's Shawn Willsey in Iceland, May 29th. Well, where exactly was I in Iceland? Well, I was on an island off the coast of Iceland with a group of people. So there I am doing my geology spiel, and we're on the Isle of Heimaey, which erupted in the 70s. So it was a little bit, it was difficult because I wanted to be near the eruption, but they had that area so locked down that even, whatever little credentials I have in Iceland wouldn't have got me any closer to it. But it was ironic that as I sat there in Iceland, I thought, I could be reporting on this and following this much better from my office in Idaho than actually being in Iceland. So I felt very inept there in terms of what I could actually do and relay to people. But that's where I was. So if some of you remember that day and you're like, where's Shawn Willsey? Isn't he like the Iceland guy? Like, well, I was there. But I was out on this island looking at an older eruption. So we did, though, I don't have a picture of this, we were able to, that day, because we left the island that day and we literally were flying out on our flights the next morning, and we drove near the airport and you could see it in the distance, and someone had like a spotting scope, and so we could see it at a distance, and all the people I was with, people who'd never seen an eruption, they thought it was great looking at an eruption from 5 miles away and a little bit of red and some gas. They were ecstatic, and I was just sort of like, I've seen much better, and like we could be so much closer to this thing, but anyway. So, but one person in our group, she stayed an extra day, and she teamed up with Johan, who I work with from Nature Eye, and he got her in a little bit closer. This is the road. There's Grindavik right here. There's the berm, and she's looking at a lava flow that's a day old. So that black lava that covered the road there, she brought a rock back. It was still hot or warm, she said, when she collected it. So that's literally a one-day-old lava field there in that area, which is pretty remarkable. This is a view. Grindavik is down there, so we're looking kind of to the south. Here's the power plant and the Blue Lagoon. Here's the berm here. So you can see, it's a little hard to tell with the lighting, but some of this is still glowing. So we had a lava flow come across the roadway. They've gotten pretty good in Iceland about like lava covers the roadway. You wait a few days, you bring in the bulldozers, and you just put the new road right over the top of that thing. They've gotten really good about just reestablishing roadways. Losing a road to lava is at worst a 1-week speed bump in the grand scheme of things. So they're kind of learning to live a little bit with these volcanic eruptions, which is good. And the interesting thing here is these berms do a good job of diverting the lava. Remember, the lava fills up the landscape on one side of the berm, and so they do run the risk of the berms can only build up so high, and once the lava rises to that height, it can spill over a little bit, and that's actually what happened. I'll show you here in a second where that happened. But here's the road to the Blue Lagoon's up here. Here's the town. This is the road leading to the west of town. But you can see how quickly, by June 8th, this road was reestablished right across that flow there. And then this view here, power plant and the Blue Lagoon are down here. Here's the active spatter cone, and the lava flow comes around this hill here. But right here, you can see where it starts to flow over. So in early June, there was some concern that this could flow over it was flowing over the berm, and if it kept going, this area is all flat here. If that lava had progressed, it might have gone over here and impacted the power plant a little bit. They actually, for a while, I didn't bring a photo of this, but they actually, for a while, were spraying water on it too to see how effective that was at like cooling the lava and stopping it a bit in its tracks. So they're coming up with some innovative solutions, but is it going to be effective? Ultimately, they're at the whim of what the volcano does and exactly where the lava erupts. There's a good chance that the eruption could take place closer to the town. This is a view from a few weeks ago, I guess, about a month ago. So there's the spatter cone kind of in its waning stages. There's a lava flow that goes around the north, and then this curled around towards the Blue Lagoon. But then on the south side, we have this perched lava pond. So lava was coming out of the base of the cone and then as the lava cools along the margin, it builds up the sides, and that allows you to fill more of the interior. So literally, like, think of like an elevated pool of lava. That's what we call these perched lava ponds here. But some spectacular footage. I'm sure a lot of you have seen some of that. And here's where that lava was pouring over the berm. Here, these two spots here, one over here. And they were trying to build a secondary berm and just doing what they could. Luckily, this kind of ended as the lava flow was kind of waning. So it worked out pretty well in this case that the eruption was pretty much over when the spillover happened. So there wasn't a whole lot of lava coming across this thing moving forward. So what's next? Where are we at? So I brought you up to date as of a few weeks ago, late June. Right now, what's happening in Iceland? No eruption. Earthquakes? Not really. Uplift? Yes. The uplift is still going on. You can see that here. So here is June. So here's the eruption on May 29th that brought the elevation back down. But since then, it started to rise. The last couple days, it has kind of flattened out a little bit. But we expect that that's going to continue, that upward trend. So we are preparing and priming, if you will, for a future event. Could be an eruption. Could be magma pushing its way into the subsurface and cooling somewhere else. Who knows? Where will the location be? I don't know. If someone knows, please come to the microphone and inform the rest of us. But no one knows for sure. I found this article interesting. This just came out, what's the date there? July 14th, 16th. So that's literally just 4 or 5 days ago. Increased probability of eruption within the borders of Grindavik. So the one line of thinking here is that there's so many fractures and cracks running through the town that there's already a conduit and a pathway for the magma to go there. And will it actually do that? I don't know. I think it's more likely to stay a little bit further to the north, at least for this next time. But anything kind of goes. Anywhere along that trend is possible moving forward. So
are all these people still gone from this town?
the town was evacuated. Good question. The town was evacuated, and that was mandatory. And they were kept. Most of them had friends and family they could go stay with. They did set up some like shelters at like churches or schools where people could like sleep. But most people, it wasn't that many people. 9,000 people were able to find people to stay with. They were let back into the town to get their stuff on and off, but then they were allowed to stay overnight in their town, I think in March or so. I can't remember the exact month, but they could go back and live there. So when I went through Grindavik, I met a gentleman, an older gentleman who was living in his house and kind of like dealing with it. So those residents can stay there if they choose to. A lot of them have chosen, the government ended up pooling the funding and initiating a house buyout program. So basically, the government was prepared to buy people's houses at, I think it was like 95% of fire sale value, so maybe not exactly what it's worth, but darn close. And so the one gal I know, Amanda Joe, who lives there, that's what they chose to do. So they have completely sold their house to the government, were able to use those funds to get a new home. What the government's going to do with those houses moving forward and what the future of Grindavik looks like, it's a lot of unknowns. The fishing, it still takes place there, so the businesses are still working. But yeah, it's kind of, it's a disaster movie in slow motion with no end in sight. So it's maybe like the worst movie you'd want to go to, because you're like, when is this movie going to end? Because like, I'm still here, and it's like, where are we going here? So anyway, with that, that's my last slide. So I thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you might have. Yeah.
These data points where you show the land is lifting, rising.
Yep.
What area does that take into consideration?
So she asked about the GPS points, the land rising and such. They're for a fixed station. So there's a given station that has a GPS station there that monitors each day, sometimes several times a day, the north-south motion, east-west, and the up-down motion. It's just 1 point for one place, which isn't very helpful in and of itself, but when we have 20 of those in the region, then we can start to see things a little better in 3 dimensions and start to figure out what's happening regionally. Yeah.
Right, so if you've got multiple ones then, do you average them together? Is that the result is up here?
Are you talking about like the bullseye thing, the colored thing, or?
This one here.
Oh, like that. This.
Is that just one point?
Yeah, this specific graph. Thank you for addressing this. This is for one station, and I chose here because it's more dramatic to not show you the north-south and the east-west motion, but just the up-down motion. So this specifically shows you for this period of time the upward motion of this station, and I think each red dot is 8 hours apart. So take a measurement 8 hours, another 8 hours, another data point, another data point. The little black bars are just error bars. So there's weird things that kind of happen, like the sun comes out, it's a hot day, that actually causes the land to rise a little bit because the temperature, just expansion, and then it actually falls a little bit, but it's minuscule. And so that's the up and down portion of it. So.
I guess to further ask too, so if you've got multiple points throughout this region, do you see more rise in some areas and less in others? And does that show, and does it correlate to where the eruptions are happening?
Yeah, so her question's about like where we see the rise. Do all of them show, some of the stations show more rise than others, and some show little to no. So if you go like, 10 kilometers away and there's like no rise, what that tells us then is that's an area that's not affected by the intrusion of the magma. So it's helping us sort of spatially constrain the extent of the magma storage zone that's causing the rise. If I'm hopefully. What's that?
You started the update, you had multiple sites.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't show as many now. I don't know. Yeah. You can deep dive the GPS stuff and look at all the stations, and yeah, good question. In the back, yeah.
This may be a little off topic, but the famous Naples outside of Naples that demonstrate a lot of these things. I wonder if you were looking at that, or paying attention to it, or any comment.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people through YouTube asking me to comment or talk about the activity in Italy. To be completely honest, I'm pretty much at bandwidth just following the geology and the volcanoes I do follow. Secondarily, I don't know, and I haven't really put the effort into accessing the Italian scientific data I would need to do that justice. So I know how to get to the data in the Iceland system. I know how to get to USGS data for things in the States, but I would not even know where to begin to go look for Italian GPS and INSAR data and some of those sorts of things. So I can say that the Naples, Campi Flegrei system, those big systems like Yellowstone, oftentimes show periods of inflation and rising. I mean, everyone's focused on Italy and freaking out a little bit because there's earthquakes and inflation going on there. That happens in Yellowstone every year. There are periods of time in Yellowstone where we have earthquake activity, seismic swarms, right, clusters of earthquakes, and inflation, and 99.9% of the time, none of those result in any sort of eruption. Those are pretty typical of those large caldera systems. They tend to like rise and fall. So I guess I'm not super worried about it, but I haven't really had the time to look at it. So, yeah. Over here, then we'll do this one. Yeah. I think your question is, in the basin and range, we have extension, right? So that's like Nevada and parts of Idaho. It's right, and then we have faulting, like Boar Peak, so things going up and down. Isostatic rebound is more, well, isostatic rebound implies you had some sort of pressure over the region that's since been removed, and so you're rebounding from that. So examples of that would be Lake Bonneville down in Utah. There was a huge Lake Michigan-sized lake sitting over the Salt Lake Basin. All that weight of that water pushed down on the crust when the lake drained out and we had the Bonneville flood. And once that lake was gone, the area rebounded over thousands of years, and it's still rebounding a little bit. In Iceland, we do see a lot of isostatic rebound because what was covering their landscape was ice and glaciers, and the weight of the ice pushing down on the landscape. Then once the glaciers are gone, you do get some isostatic rebound there.
All these earthquakes happening now, how come there's not more rebound?
No, the rebound thing is more, the isostatic rebound is when you have something on top of it and then you can get the rebound effect. Isostasy always takes place. It's just the way the crust compensates for different densities of different materials. So the magma's low density, it wants to rise, and it will rise until it's neutrally buoyant. So just because we have magma coming up through the Earth's crust doesn't mean it's going to make a volcano, right? A good example of that is City of Rocks, south of Burley. There is a big playground of granite that folks like me like to rock climb on. There's no evidence that when that magma was there was a volcano on top of it. So that magma came up, was still underground, stayed there, and cooled and solidified and crystallized without rising all the way to the surface. What happened on November 10th in Iceland? Magma came within a half a kilometer of the surface, and then just stopped. So there's different levels of buoyancy depending on the composition of the magma, the gases in the magma, and then what it's moving through. If it's moving through more dense material, it's going to have easier time getting through it than if it's lower density material. Maybe I danced around enough of your question there, so sorry. We can talk more later. Yeah, right here and then here.
Is there any concern about earthquakes off the coast and like creating a tsunami?
No, not for me. Earthquakes off the coast on the mid-Atlantic ridge happen all the time, and they will happen more in the future. But those earthquakes generally aren't going to be large enough. You'd have to have a very large earthquake, shallow earthquake, to create the dynamics for a tsunami. So it's low probability. Earthquake, high probability. Consequences and tsunami generation would be very low probability. Yeah, just not the right dynamics for that. Yep.
So how in the world did the hot spot in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge line up?
That's probably a long-winded answer.
Neither one is moving, so it's going to stay that way for who knows how long.
The hotspot we think mostly stays fixed. What does change though is the plate boundary chases the hotspot. So the hotspot's an area of weakened hot rock. So the plate boundary, the plates are spreading in a little bit of an uneven manner. And so that's why we get these migration and movements of the plate boundary over time through. And so the hotspot is over there by the big glacier I pointed out at the beginning. That's where the hotspot is. But as the hotspot comes up, it has a tail to it. So it actually comes up like a mushroom, and it fans out. And so some of it's feeding the Reykjanes Peninsula, some of it's feeding these other places. What's that? So plate boundaries, the short answer I guess would be plate boundaries will take advantage. Plates are moving in whatever direction. Think of them like vectors, right? But they will also take advantage of weaknesses in the rock. And weaknesses often come in the form of high heat flow. So if you have an area of hot rock, like a hot spot, the plate boundary will most likely be located at that hot spot. And so, no, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is a fundamental plate boundary, but the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is in Iceland because there's a hot spot in Iceland, if that makes sense. Yeah, so there's, yeah, good stuff. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah, one more, two more?
I took a geology class like 27 years ago. I know nothing except for...
No, you know lots. You know stuff.
This could be a really stupid question. They're building berms to try to show to guide some of the lava and keep it out.
Yeah.
Is there any cutting into the ground to try to slice areas like a big potato?
No, that's a great question, and lots of people have proposed, instead of building up, why aren't you trenching down? I'm not an engineer, I don't know if I can answer that explicitly, but excavating is a lot more work, I think, than just piling stuff up, and excavating solid rock is a lot of work. So I don't know. I mean, I know they've definitely considered that, and I think they're doing something that's effective, quick, can be done efficiently, and they think is probably the most bang for their buck. They're spending a lot of, not dollars because it's krona, but they're spending a lot of money in Iceland doing all this, and there's lots of people that think it's a lost cause, why we're spending money, and then it just gets really political and everything else. But it's a good idea, and so I think it's been looked at a little bit. So.
Yeah, I just had a question. On the first eruption in 2021, the behavior of that was just crazy because you're erupting and you have thousands of fountains, and then
Yeah, it was a weird eruption, went on for 6 months, but it was the first anything that happened in that area for 800 years, so maybe there's not like... Yeah, so saying it's odd is like, well, what do you compare it to, right? So it's, but compared to all the ones that came after it, it does seem quite different, so...
September 11th, which is crazy.
Yeah, so they've all...
Coming out of the bottom of the big lava lake.
Yeah, it was a different one for sure, yeah.
Just to add to that comment, I think we have to remember that all these are seconds apart in geologic time.
Sure.
Yeah,
No,
it may seem like a long time to us for 6 months, but
yeah, no, piggybacking onto that, I've always thought how interesting it is. You know, I showed you the timeline of all those periods of eruptions, and, you know, we can't look back at the eruption period from 800 to 1200 years ago. We can't look at that and be like, oh, there was an eruption, and then 2 months later there was another one. We can't see that level of detail and that resolution. We can see it now because we're watching it happen in real time, and we can document it with cameras and videos and stuff. But it makes me wonder, you know, if I sent the three of you off in a spaceship for 300 years and brought you back, and you were looking at that landscape, could you tell how many eruptions had taken place? Probably not, because it would look like they're so sequential, they would look like it's all happening at once. There's not soil horizons between the individual lava flows, there's not erosion, it's all taking place sequentially. Yeah, it's interesting, kind of interesting. So, yeah, 2 more questions and we'll end. I know people probably are done.
How useful are the earthquakes in this system now currently for predicting location and timing of eruptions?
I don't think the earthquakes are helpful right now. If we see earthquakes now, so right now as I look at the earthquake data, there's not much happening. But if...
When they start occurring.
Right, so what I'm looking for is if I start seeing more substantial earthquake activity, clustering in time and location, that would indicate, and we're not going to see that unless it moves into a new location. So if it follows the same pathways it's been following, we're likely to not see much seismic activity until it's really close to erupting, then we'll see a little bit.
But the eruptions you've gone through here recently in the last 6 months, have they been very useful in predicting the earthquake?
We see a little bit of seismic noise right before the eruption within hours basically. Right, but think back to November when there was all the big earthquakes that destroyed the town and sent people evacuated. That's because magma was breaking through rock it hadn't broken before and setting up a plumbing system, right? Setting up a conduit to carry that to the surface. So as long as we keeps following that system, little earthquake activity. But if it starts going into some other direction, then we would see an uptick in seismic activity. Really good question. Yeah. Yeah, there was some lava tubes in this last eruption. I mean, I don't know if they're vacated and we could like hike through them right now, like that kind of lava tube, but there was definitely tube systems that were forming on the north side of the spatter cone during this last eruption. You could see the lava flowing, you could see like a crusted over section of rock, and you could see it coming out further. So some were short, there were probably bigger ones in the subsurface we couldn't see. So, yeah. So. When I was there in May, no. You could come into it's gone back and forth. There's times where you can drive into the Blue Lagoon just as a regular person and whatever, and you could be very close to the most recent flows. Other times they're only letting people go into the Blue Lagoon who like have a reservation for that day and are actually going to go use the facilities. When we were there, we could stop along the road. Like when I took my students there, we stopped along the road. There weren't any signs saying we couldn't. And we walked like 20 yards to the March lava, and they all got to hold a chunk of that fairly young rock. So yeah, so it's dynamic. It changes all the time. Yeah, so awesome. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming out. If there's other questions, yeah. Yeah, and I'm happy to hang out a little longer and answer any questions. But thanks to the museum and all those that came. Thank you. Sorry I interrupted you.